Cassandra Whitaker moved through the civilian training facility like morning mist present, but barely noticed. At 32, she possessed the kind of understated presence that allowed her to blend into any environment. Her brown hair was always pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her gray eyes held a depth that suggested she had seen more than most people twice her age. The Fort Harrison Training Center was supposed to be a fresh start. After leaving her previous life behind 3 years ago, Cassandra had applied for a simple medical assistant position. Nothing more, nothing less. She wanted to help people heal, maintain equipment, and disappear into the background of other people's stories. But fresh starts were harder to come by than she had hoped. The facility buzzed with the constant energy of combat veterans and eager recruits preparing for various military and security positions. The air smelled of gun oil, sweat, and the particular brand of masculine confidence that came from men who had seen action overseas. Most of the trainees were indeed men, and they had developed a particular culture over the months before Cassandra's arrival. It was a culture that did not easily welcome quiet women who kept to themselves. From her first day, Cassandra noticed the sideways glances and whispered comments. She cleaned medical equipment with surgical precision, restocked supplies with methodical efficiency, and maintained practice rifles with the kind of care that impressed even the instructors. Yet somehow, her competence only seemed to make her more invisible. The other trainees had dubbed her Ghost Nurse. Behind her back, a nickname that followed her through the corridors like an unwelcome shadow. She would catch fragments of conversations. As she passed, "Did you see how she cleaned those rifle barrels? Weird how she never talks about where she came from. Probably just took a bunch of first aid courses online." Cassandra never responded to their speculation. She had learned long ago that some secrets were better kept buried, especially when they came wrapped in grief and guilt that still woke her up most nights. The facility's head instructor was Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, a gruff ex-Marine, with 23 years of service and opinions about everything. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and carried himself with the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. Rodriguez had a particular way of managing people. He found their weaknesses quickly and used them to maintain control. Within her first week, Rodriguez had identified Cassandra as someone who would not push back. "Hey, Ghost Nurse," he called. Out during her second week, his voice carrying across the equipment bay where she was organizing medical supplies. "Think you can handle restocking the ammunition storage? Or is that too complicated for someone who just bandages scraped knees?" A few trainees looked up from their equipment maintenance, curious to see how she would respond. Cassandra simply nodded and continued her work, never meeting Rodriguez's eyes directly. "Yes, Sergeant," she said quietly. "I can handle that." Rodriguez smiled, a kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Good. And while you're at it, the practice rifles in Building C need a complete breakdown and cleaning. Should keep you busy through the weekend." It was Friday afternoon. Most of the trainees were planning to head into town for the weekend. Cassandra understood the message clearly. You are not one of us, and you will not be treated like one of us. But what Rodriguez and the others could not see were the small things that set Cassandra apart. The way her hands never trembled, even during the most stressful moments. How she moved through the facility with an economy of motion that suggested extensive training. The old military watch she wore that she never took off, its scratched face, catching the light as she worked. Most telling of all was how she maintained the practice rifles. While other support staff simply followed the basic cleaning protocols, Cassandra performed maintenance with a level of precision that bordered on reverence. She knew the exact tension required for each component, understood how environmental factors affected performance, and could spot problems that others missed entirely. Late that Friday evening, as she worked alone in the equipment bay, Cassandra allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She pulled out a worn photograph from her pocket, an older man in military dress uniform, his eyes sharp and focused. Her father, Colonel Jack Whitaker, photographed during his prime, when his name was whispered with reverence in military circles around the world. "I'm trying to keep my promise, Dad," she whispered to the empty room. "But this is harder than I thought it would be." Outside, she could hear the distant sounds of laughter as the trainees headed into town for their weekend of freedom. Inside, Cassandra continued her solitary work, unaware that her quiet competence was already beginning to plant seeds of curiosity in the minds of a few observant individuals. Monday morning brought a new kind of tension to the training facility. Rodriguez had spent his weekend devising what he considered an improvement to the facility's efficiency standards. He gathered all personnel in the main briefing room, his expression serious as he outlined new protocols. "Effective immediately," Rodriguez announced, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "All support staff will be required to arrive 1 hour earlier each day. This will ensure equipment is properly prepared before training begins." Cassandra felt a familiar tightness in her chest. The new schedule meant arriving at 5 in the morning instead of 6, a small change that would significantly impact her already limited personal time. But it was the way Rodriguez was looking directly at her while making the announcement that made her understand this was not about facility efficiency. Additionally, Rodriguez continued, still maintaining eye contact with Cassandra. "Medical support staff will now be responsible for detailed equipment reports on all firearms used during training. These reports must be completed and submitted before end of day, every day." A trainee named David Peterson raised his hand. Peterson was one of the older recruits, a former Army sergeant who had been respectful to Cassandra from the beginning. "Sergeant Rodriguez, that seems like a significant increase in workload for one person. Should we consider, did I ask?" For commentary, Peterson, Rodriguez cut him off sharply. "The protocols are established. Anyone who cannot meet these standards is welcome to seek employment elsewhere." After the briefing, Peterson approached Cassandra as she gathered her materials. "That was directed at you," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure they were not overheard. "He's trying to push you out." "I can handle the workload," Cassandra replied, though she appreciated his concern. It was the first time in weeks that anyone had acknowledged the obvious targeting she was experiencing. "It's not about whether you can handle it," Peterson said. "It's about whether you should have to. This is harassment, pure and simple." Cassandra looked at Peterson carefully. In his eyes, she saw something she had almost forgotten existed: basic human decency. But she also saw something else: curiosity about why she never fought back, never complained, never seemed to break under the mounting pressure. "I'll be fine," she said simply, "but thank you for noticing." Over the following weeks, the pressure escalated systematically. Rodriguez found new ways to isolate Cassandra from the rest of the group. She was assigned to different meal times, given tasks that kept her working during breaks, and excluded from group briefings that contained information she needed to do her job effectively. The other trainees began to notice the pattern. Some seemed uncomfortable with the obvious unfairness, while others appeared to view it as entertainment. A few started making small gestures of support, leaving coffee near her workspace, or quietly sharing information she had missed during briefings. She was not allowed to attend, but Rodriguez was not finished. He began questioning her work publicly, even when it was flawless. During a facility inspection, he spent 15 minutes examining equipment Cassandra had maintained, searching for any flaw he could highlight in front of the group. "Interesting technique," he commented as he inspected a rifle she had cleaned. "Where exactly did you learn firearms maintenance? Online courses?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Cassandra could feel the attention of everyone in the room focused on her. For a moment, Something flickered in her gray eyes, a flash of something deeper and more complex than the quiet compliance everyone expected. "Various sources, Sergeant," she replied evenly. "I believe in being thorough." Rodriguez set the rifle down with more force than necessary. "Well, thorough or not, I want all weapons maintenance double-checked by qualified personnel before they are returned to service. We cannot afford mistakes with equipment this important." The implication was clear. Her work could not be trusted. Peterson shook his head in disgust, and a few other trainees exchanged uncomfortable glances. But Cassandra simply nodded and continued her assigned tasks. That evening, as she worked late once again, Cassandra found herself thinking about her father's words. The mark of a true professional is not how they perform when respected, but how they maintain standards when disrespected. She touched the old watch on her wrist, feeling the familiar comfort of its weight. Hidden in her quarters was a box of commendation certificates and photographs that told a very different story about her qualifications, but those belonged to a different life, a life she had walked away from for reasons that still haunted her dreams. As she finished her work and prepared to leave, Cassandra noticed Peterson waiting near the exit. "I've been watching this situation develop," he said without preamble. "Rodriguez is building a case to have you dismissed. False performance issues, manufactured complaints, the whole playbook." "I know," Cassandra replied quietly. "So what are you going to do about it?" For the first time since arriving at the facility, Cassandra smiled a small, enigmatic expression that somehow changed her entire face. "I'm going to do my job," she said. "And I'm going to wait." "Wait for what?" "For the right moment," she replied, then walked into the night, leaving Peterson with more questions than answers. The moment came 3 weeks later during what should have been a routine training exercise. Rodriguez had arranged for a visiting instructor to observe the facility's operations, Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, a decorated officer who was evaluating the program for potential military partnerships. Cassandra understood immediately that this was Rodriguez's opportunity to solidify his case against her. Throughout the morning, he had been particularly vocal about maintaining standards and ensuring only qualified personnel handle critical equipment. The demonstration was going smoothly until Rodriguez decided to make Cassandra part of the show. "Colonel Harrison," he announced during a break in the firearms training, "I'd like to highlight the importance of proper equipment maintenance in our program." He gestured for Cassandra to join them near the weapons display. She approached with her usual quiet composure, but something in Rodriguez's expression warned her that this would be different from his previous public criticisms. "Our medical support staff handles routine maintenance on practice weapons," Rodriguez explained to Colonel Harrison. "But as you can see, there are clear limitations to what civilians can be expected to understand about military-grade equipment." Rodriguez picked up a rifle that Cassandra had maintained the previous day. With deliberate showmanship, he began field stripping the weapon, his movements sharp and precise. "For instance," he continued, "improper tension on the bolt carrier group can lead to misfires or jamming. Civilian training rarely covers these critical details." As he reassembled the rifle, Rodriguez made a subtle but deliberate adjustment, loosening a component that Cassandra had properly tightened. It was a small change that would not affect basic function, but would create problems during extended use. "Let's test the maintenance quality," Rodriguez announced, raising the rifle and aiming at a distant target. The weapon fired normally for the first few rounds, but as Rodriguez had intended, it began to malfunction on the fourth shot. "As you can see," Rodriguez said, turning to Colonel Harrison with exaggerated disappointment, "inadequate maintenance leads to equipment failure. This is exactly the kind of problem that could endanger lives in real-world applications." The gathered trainees watched in uncomfortable silence. Peterson's jaw was clenched with barely controlled anger. Even some of Rodriguez's supporters looked uneasy with the obviously staged demonstration. Colonel Harrison examined the rifle, his experienced eye immediately identifying the loosened component. But before he could comment, Rodriguez pressed his advantage. "I'm afraid this highlights a broader problem with our current staffing situation," Rodriguez continued. "We need personnel who understand that this work requires military precision, not civilian approximation." It was a direct attack on Cassandra's competence and, by extension, her right to remain at the facility. Rodriguez had carefully constructed a public scenario designed to humiliate her and justify her dismissal. For a long moment, Cassandra stood perfectly still, her gray eyes fixed on the sabotaged rifle in Rodriguez's hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but carried an undertone that made several people straighten instinctively. "Sergeant Rodriguez," she said quietly, "would you mind if I examined that rifle?" Rodriguez hesitated, clearly not expecting her to challenge him directly. "I don't think that's necessary. Actually, I'd like to see what our medical assistant notices." Colonel Harrison interjected, his tone neutral but interested. "Please proceed." Cassandra took the rifle and began her own inspection. Her movements were fluid and precise, demonstrating a familiarity with the weapon that went far beyond basic maintenance training. Within moments, she had identified and corrected the loosened component. The bolt carrier group was improperly seated, she explained to Colonel Harrison, her voice taking on a technical precision that surprised everyone present. "When tension is insufficient, it creates exactly the malfunction pattern we observed normal function initially, followed by consistent jamming after thermal expansion from repeated firing." She reassembled the weapon with movement so smooth and automatic that even Rodriguez found himself watching intently. This particular rifle also shows signs of improper cleaning of the gas system, which compounds the problem. The carbon buildup in the gas tube creates additional pressure inconsistencies. Colonel Harrison took the rifle and examined Cassandra's work. His eyebrows raised slightly as he recognized the level of expertise she had just demonstrated. "That's a very thorough analysis," he said carefully. "Where did you develop this level of technical knowledge?" It was the question everyone had been wondering about for months. Cassandra looked around the group, her gaze lingering for a moment on Peterson's encouraging expression, then settling on Rodriguez's increasingly uncomfortable face. "I had a good teacher," she said simply. But something in her posture had changed. The quiet, almost submissive woman who had endured months of harassment had been replaced by someone else, entirely someone who moved with the confidence of extensive training and carried herself with a bearing that suggested military background. Rodriguez sensed the shift and attempted to regain control of the situation. "Regardless of theoretical knowledge," he said loudly, "practical application under pressure is what really matters. Anyone can take apart a rifle when there's no real stakes involved." "You're absolutely right," Cassandra replied. And for the first time since arriving at the facility, she smiled with something that looked almost like anticipation. Practical application under pressure is exactly what matters most. That evening, Colonel Harrison requested a private meeting with facility leadership. The conversation was brief, but resulted in an immediate change to the training schedule. A comprehensive marksmanship evaluation would be conducted the following week, with all personnel required to participate. Rodriguez announced the news with obvious satisfaction, certain that he would finally have the opportunity to demonstrate Cassandra's limitations in an area where excuses would be impossible. He had no idea that he had just triggered the very situation Cassandra had been quietly waiting for. The announcement of the mandatory marksmanship evaluation sent ripples of excitement through the training facility. For most of the trainees, it represented a chance to demonstrate skills they have been developing for months. For Rodriguez, it was the perfect opportunity to publicly expose what he believed were Cassandra's limitations. For Cassandra herself, it was something else entirely, a moment she had been both dreading and anticipating since her first day at the facility. That evening, she sat alone in her small quarters, holding the worn photograph of her father, Colonel Jack Phantom Whitaker, had been one of the most legendary snipers in modern military history, capable of making impossible shots under impossible conditions. But more than his technical skills, he had been known for his wisdom about when and why you use such abilities. The greatest victory, he had often told her during their early morning training sessions, is the fight you never have to have because your opponent understands what they're truly facing. Cassandra had spent 3 years trying to leave that world behind, trying to find peace in a simpler life where her skills were not needed. But Rodriguez's systematic harassment had created a situation where her silence was no longer protecting anyone, least of all herself. The next morning, Peterson approached her during the brief break between equipment maintenance and medical duties. "I heard about the evaluation," he said quietly. "Rodriguez is planning something. He's been talking to some of the other instructors about making sure it's challenging enough to separate real skill from beginner's luck." Cassandra nodded, unsurprised. "What kind of challenges?" "Extended range targets, time pressure, multiple shooting positions. He wants to create conditions where anyone without extensive training will fail publicly." Peterson studied her face carefully. "The thing is, I don't think he realizes what he might be dealing with." "What do you mean?" Peterson glanced around to ensure they were not being overheard. "I've been in the military for 15 years. I know what professional weapons maintenance looks like, and I know what civilian first aid training covers." "What I've watched you do over the past few months doesn't fit either category." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "Yesterday, when you analyzed that rifle malfunction, you demonstrated knowledge that takes years of specialized training to develop. And the way you move around weapons, there's a familiarity there that goes way beyond basic safety courses." Cassandra remained silent, but Peterson continued. "I'm not asking you to tell me your story, but I am telling you that whatever Rodriguez thinks he's setting up, he might be in for a surprise." That afternoon, Cassandra received an unexpected visitor. Colonel Harrison had returned to the facility and requested to speak with her privately. They met in the small medical office where she typically completed her paperwork. "I've been thinking about yesterday's demonstration," Harrison began without preamble. "Your analysis of that rifle malfunction was remarkably sophisticated. It showed understanding of not just basic maintenance, but advanced ballistics and weapon systems engineering." Cassandra listened carefully, uncertain where the conversation was heading. "I also noticed something else," Harrison continued. "When you handled that rifle, your movements suggested extensive training with that specific weapon system. The M4 platform in particular." Harrison leaned forward slightly. "I served alongside some very skilled personnel over the years. I recognize certain patterns in how people with extensive experience handle weapons. You demonstrated several of those patterns yesterday." "Sir, I'm just a medical assistant," Cassandra replied carefully. "Are you?" Harrison asked directly. "Because I've made some inquiries since yesterday. There are gaps in your employment history that are interesting, and your application materials, while complete, are remarkably light on specific details about your background." Cassandra felt a familiar tension building in her chest. She had hoped to avoid exactly this kind of scrutiny. "I'm not trying to create problems for you," Harrison continued, "but I am curious about whether you're aware of what Sergeant Rodriguez is planning for this evaluation." "I assume it will be challenging," Cassandra replied. Harrison nodded. "Rodriguez has specifically requested permission to use extended range targets out to 800 meters. He's also arranged for time pressure elements and multiple shooting positions. It's designed to be difficult even for personnel with military training. He studied her reaction carefully. The question is, are you prepared for that level of challenge? For the first time in the conversation, Cassandra allowed a small smile to cross her face. Sir, I believe I can handle whatever challenges are presented. That evening, Cassandra made a decision that she had been avoiding for 3 years. She retrieved a locked case from her closet, entered the combination she had memorized but never forgotten, and opened it for the first time since leaving her previous life. Inside were items that represented a different version of herself. Advanced shooting manuals annotated in her father's handwriting, ballistics calculators, and most significantly, a collection of commendations and certificates that told the story of her real background. Expert marksman certification, advanced sniper school graduation, commendations for exceptional performance under pressure. And at the bottom of the case, a letter from her commanding officer recommending her for advanced tactical training. A quote letter that was never acted upon because she had requested discharge instead. Cassandra had left military service not because she lacked skill, but because she had too much of it. The weight of what she was capable of had become unbearable after her father's death, when she realized that all the training in the world could not protect the people she loved most. But Rodriguez's harassment had created a different kind of situation. He was not just attacking her competence. He was trying to destroy her ability to help and heal others, which was the new purpose she had chosen for her life. As she prepared for sleep, Cassandra made a quiet promise to her father's memory. She would demonstrate her capabilities only to the extent necessary to protect her position and continue her work. Nothing more, nothing less. She had no way of knowing that Rodriguez had spent the evening making his own preparations, and that he had significantly underestimated what he was about to unleash. The morning of the marksmanship evaluation dawned clear and windless perfect conditions for precision shooting. Word had spread throughout the facility, and even off-duty personnel had gathered to watch the mandatory testing. Rodriguez had transformed what should have been a routine qualification into a spectacle. Today we separate the professionals from the pretenders, Rodriguez announced to the assembled crowd. He had arranged the targets at progressively challenging distances: 200 meters, 400 meters, and finally 800 meters, a range that would challenge even experienced military marksmen. The evaluation was structured to build pressure systematically. Each participant would have 3 minutes to engage targets at each distance, with points awarded for accuracy and speed. Most civilian trainees would be eliminated at the 400-meter mark, making the final long-range shots a demonstration of true expertise. Rodriguez had reserved Cassandra for last, ensuring maximum audience for what he expected to be her public failure. The early participants performed predictably. Most civilian trainees managed acceptable accuracy at 200 meters, but struggled significantly as distances increased. Even the military veterans found the time pressure and extended ranges challenging. Peterson shot well, demonstrating solid military training with consistent hits at all distances. A few other veterans performed similarly, earning respectful nods from the observing instructors. As Cassandra's turn approached, Rodriguez made a point of announcing her background to the crowd. Our final shooter is our medical support staff member. No military experience, civilian training only. This should provide an interesting contrast to our qualified marksman. Colonel Harrison, who had returned to observe the evaluation, watched Rodriguez's performance with growing disapproval. The exercise had clearly been designed not to evaluate skills, but to humiliate specific individuals. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Harrison interrupted. What exactly are you hoping to demonstrate with this evaluation? Rodriguez straightened, suddenly aware that his superior was not pleased with the proceedings. Sir, we're establishing baseline marksmanship competency for all facility personnel. Standard military protocol. Is it standard protocol, Harrison? Asked pointedly. To create evaluation conditions that exceed the requirements for the positions these people actually hold? Before Rodriguez could respond, Cassandra stepped forward. Colonel Harrison, if I may, she said quietly, I believe the evaluation serves a useful purpose. It's important for everyone to understand each other's actual capabilities. She moved to the shooting position with the same fluid grace that had characterized her weapons maintenance. But now it was more obvious. The economical movements of someone with extensive training. Rodriguez handed her the M4 rifle with barely concealed anticipation. 200 meters first, he announced. You have 3 minutes to engage 5 targets. Cassandra accepted the weapon and immediately began what appeared to be routine preparation. But observers with military experience noticed the subtle signs of advanced training. How she checked the weapon zero, tested the trigger pull, and assessed wind conditions with automatic precision. Her first shot rang out exactly 10 seconds after taking position. Perfect center hit. The second shot followed 5 seconds later. Another perfect hit. By the time she had engaged all 5 targets at 200 meters, a noticeable quiet had fallen over the crowd. Each shot had been perfectly placed, and her total time was under 1 minute, well ahead of most military veterans. 400 meters, Rodriguez called out, his voice slightly less confident. Same drill, 5 targets, 3 minutes. Cassandra made minor adjustments to her scope and settled into position. The longer range required more precise calculations for bullet drop and environmental factors, but she handled the adjustments with the same automatic competence. Her shots at 400 meters were equally precise. If anything, her performance improved as the challenge increased, suggesting that she was more comfortable at extended ranges than shorter ones. A murmur ran through the crowd. Even the military veterans were beginning to look impressed. Rodriguez's expression had shifted from anticipation to concern. 800 meters, Rodriguez announced, though his voice now carried a note of uncertainty. Single target, center mass, hit required. 800 meters was a distance that challenged professional military snipers. It required not just accuracy, but sophisticated understanding of ballistics, environmental factors, and advanced shooting techniques. Cassandra spent nearly a full minute studying the target through her scope, making calculations that were invisible to observers, but clearly complex. When she finally settled into her final shooting position, something had changed in her entire bearing. The uncertain medical assistant had disappeared entirely, replaced by someone who moved with the confidence and precision of elite training. Her breathing slowed to a controlled rhythm, her body found perfect stability, and her focus narrowed to the mathematical relationship between weapon, target, and environment. The shot, when it came, was different from the others. There was a quality to the sound that suggested complete technical mastery. The kind of shot that experienced marksmen recognize instantly as special. 800 meters away, the target showed a perfect center hit. The range fell completely silent. Even Rodriguez stared at the spotting scope in disbelief. Colonel Harrison stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. That's remarkable shooting, he said carefully. Where exactly did you develop this level of marksmanship skill? For a moment, Cassandra hesitated. Then she made a decision that would change everything. My father was Colonel Jack Whitaker, she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. He taught me to shoot. The reaction was immediate and electric. Every military veteran present recognized the name. Jack Phantom Whitaker was a legend, one of the most accomplished snipers in modern military history. Holy hell, whispered one of the instructors. Jack Whitaker's daughter. Peterson stared at Cassandra with new understanding. That's why you know weapons maintenance like a professional. That's why you move like you've had advanced training. Rodriguez stood frozen, suddenly realizing the magnitude of his miscalculation. He had spent months systematically harassing and attempting to humiliate the daughter of one of the most respected soldiers in modern military history. Colonel Harrison stepped closer to Cassandra, his expression mixing respect with curiosity. "Your father was a remarkable soldier," he said. "I had the privilege of working with him briefly during my early career." "If he trained you personally?" "He did," Cassandra confirmed. "From the time I was 12 until I joined the military myself, and afterward until the day he died." The crowd absorbed this information in stunned silence. The quiet medical assistant, who had endured months of mockery and harassment, had just revealed herself to be military royalty, the daughter and student of a legendary warrior. But Cassandra was not finished. She turned to face Rodriguez directly, her gray eyes now carrying the full weight of her actual authority and capability. "Sergeant Rodriguez," she said, her voice still quiet but carrying a new edge, "I believe you mentioned something about separating professionals from pretenders." The revelation of Cassandra's true identity sent shockwaves through the training facility that extended far beyond the shooting range. By evening, word had spread to every corner of the complex, and the implications were becoming clear to everyone, especially Rodriguez. Colonel Harrison requested an immediate private meeting with Rodriguez in the facility's administrative office. Cassandra was also asked to attend, along with Peterson, as a witness to recent events. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Harrison began without preamble, "I need you to explain the evaluation procedures you implemented today." Rodriguez sat rigidly at attention, clearly aware that his position had become precarious. "Sir, I was conducting standard marksmanship qualification for all personnel." "Standard qualification," Harrison repeated slowly, "typically does not include 800-meter precision shots for medical support staff. Nor does it typically involve public commentary about personnel qualifications." Harrison pulled out a folder that had appeared sometime during the afternoon. "I've spent the past few hours reviewing personnel files and making some calls to former colleagues. I've learned some very interesting information." He opened the folder and began reading. "Cassandra Whitaker, 5 years active duty, Army Special. Operations. Advanced Sniper School graduate, top 5% of class. Multiple commendations for exceptional performance under combat conditions." Harrison looked up at Rodriguez. "Does this sound like civilian training only to you, staff?" "Sergeant?" Rodriguez's face had gone pale. "Sir, her application materials did not indicate military service." "Her application materials," Harrison continued, "listed military service clearly in the employment history section. What they did not include were specific details about the nature of that service details that anyone conducting proper background verification would have discovered." Harrison turned to Cassandra. "I also learned why you left military service. Your commanding officer described it as a significant loss to the special operations community. He mentioned that you requested discharge following your father's death, despite being recommended for advanced tactical assignments." Cassandra nodded silently, the weight of those memories still evident in her expression. "Which brings me," Harrison continued, turning back to Rodriguez, "to the pattern of behavior that has been documented over the past several months." Harrison produced another folder, this one significantly thicker. "Peterson here submitted a formal report yesterday detailing systematic harassment, discriminatory treatment, and deliberate sabotage of equipment during demonstrations. Several other personnel have provided supporting statements." Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, I was maintaining facility standards. You were systematically targeting a highly qualified individual." Harrison cut him off sharply. "Based on assumptions about her capabilities that 5 minutes of proper research would have corrected. Harrison stood and walked to the window overlooking the training grounds. "Do you understand what you've done here, Rodriguez? You've spent months harassing the daughter of one of the most respected soldiers in modern military history. A woman who could have been an asset to this facility from day one, if you had bothered to treat her with basic professional respect." The room fell silent except for the sound of Rodriguez's increasingly labored breathing. "Sir," Rodriguez attempted, "I had no way of knowing about her background." "You had every way of knowing," Harrison replied coldly. "Her employment application, background check, and references were all available to you. You chose not to look, because you had already decided what you thought about her based on your own biases." Harrison returned to his seat and fixed Rodriguez with a steady stare. "Here's what's going to happen. You will issue a formal apology to Miss Whitaker for your unprofessional conduct. You will also issue a facility-wide memo acknowledging her qualifications and contributions." Rodriguez opened his mouth to object, but Harrison continued without pause. "Additionally, you will undergo mandatory training on professional conduct and equal treatment of personnel. This training will be documented in your permanent file." Harrison's voice grew even more serious. "Finally, you will understand that any further incidents of discriminatory behavior will result in immediate termination and a recommendation that you not be eligible for rehire at any military-affiliated facility." The meeting concluded with Rodriguez's reluctant agreement to Harrison's terms, though his resentment was obvious to everyone present. As they left the administrative building, Peterson walked alongside Cassandra. "I have to ask," he said quietly, "why didn't you tell anyone about your background from the beginning? It would have saved you months of harassment." Cassandra was quiet for a long moment before responding. "After my father died, I wanted to start over. I wanted to help people heal instead of what I was trained to do." She paused. "I thought if I could just blend in, do good work quietly, maybe I could find some peace with the person I used to be. And now?" Cassandra looked back toward the training facility, where lights were still on in several buildings and the sounds of evening training exercises echoed across the grounds. "Now I think maybe there's room for both versions of myself," she said. "The person who wants to help others heal and the person who has skills that might be useful when they're really needed." Peterson nodded. "For what it's worth, I think your father would be proud of how you handled this situation. You didn't lose your temper, didn't abuse your abilities, and you protected your position without destroying Rodriguez in the process." That evening, Cassandra sat alone in her quarters with her father's photograph and the letter he had left for her. For the first time since his death, she felt like she had honored both his memory and her own values. But she also knew that Rodriguez, despite his public compliance with Harrison's directives, was unlikely to accept this resolution gracefully. Men like him rarely forgave being proven so completely wrong, especially in front of colleagues and subordinates. The real test would come in the following days, when the immediate oversight was removed and Rodriguez had to decide whether to accept the new reality or find more subtle ways to continue his campaign against her. Rodriguez's forced apology came 3 days later during the facility's weekly all-hands meeting. His words were technically correct, but delivered with barely concealed resentment that everyone in attendance could feel. "I want to acknowledge," Rodriguez said through gritted teeth, "that I made incorrect assumptions about Miss Whitaker's qualifications and experience. Her background includes significant military training that I failed to properly review." He paused, his jaw working visibly as he forced out the next words. "Ms. Whitaker has demonstrated exceptional competence in all assigned duties, and I regret any misunderstandings that may have occurred." The apology satisfied the letter of Colonel Harrison's requirements while making it clear to everyone present that Rodriguez considered this a humiliation rather than a genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Cassandra accepted the apology with quiet dignity, but she could see in Rodriguez's eyes that this was far from over. Men like him did not forget being made to look foolish, especially when their authority was challenged in front of subordinates. Her instincts proved correct too. Weeks later, Colonel Harrison had departed after completing his facility evaluation, leaving Rodriguez once again in primary control of daily operations. Within days, he had begun implementing what he called enhanced training protocols, modifications to facility procedures that appeared neutral on paper, but were clearly designed to create new forms of pressure on Cassandra. The changes were subtle but systematic. Cassandra found herself assigned to night shifts more frequently, often with insufficient advance notice to plan accordingly. Equipment she needed for her duties would mysteriously become unavailable just before scheduled tasks. Reports she submitted would be returned with demands for minor revisions that served no practical purpose except to consume her time. Most significantly, Rodriguez began scheduling mandatory training sessions during Cassandra's assigned break periods, then marking her as unavailable for additional duties when she missed them due to conflicting assignments he had given her. Himself, Peterson, and several other trainees noticed the pattern, but Rodriguez was careful to ensure that each individual incident appeared reasonable when viewed in isolation. It was only the cumulative pattern that revealed the deliberate nature of his campaign. "He's building a new case," Peterson warned Cassandra during one of their brief conversations. "Death by 1,000 cuts. He can't attack your competence anymore, so he's going after your reliability and availability." Cassandra understood the strategy. Rodriguez was creating documentation that would support a narrative of poor performance and inability to meet facility requirements, a narrative that would be much harder to disprove than his previous attacks on her technical capabilities. The situation reached its climax during the third week of Rodriguez's renewed campaign. A group of new recruits had arrived for advanced tactical training, including several who would be deploying overseas within months. During a complex exercise involving multiple buildings and simulated combat scenarios, one of the recruits became separated from his unit and disoriented in an unfamiliar section of the training complex. Private Michael Torres, barely 21 years old and on his first assignment away from basic training, had taken a wrong turn during the exercise and found himself lost in a maintenance area that was supposed to be off-limits during active training. In his confusion and anxiety, he had accidentally triggered an emergency alarm system that locked down the entire section. The lockdown created a dangerous situation. Torres was trapped in a space with no communication equipment, no clear exit route, and exercise ammunition that could cause serious injury if mishandled. The automated lockdown would not release for 30 minutes, and the facility's emergency response protocols required clearing all other personnel from the area before attempting a rescue. Rodriguez, as senior instructor, was responsible for coordinating the emergency response. But instead of focusing on Torres's safety, he saw an opportunity to create a crisis that would further his campaign against Cassandra. "Ms. Whitaker," Rodriguez announced loudly enough for other personnel to hear, "you're assigned to coordinate medical response for this situation. I want detailed protocols and equipment readiness reports on my desk immediately." It was an impossible assignment. The emergency protocols required medical personnel to remain clear of the affected area until the situation was resolved. There were no meaningful reports to generate or equipment to prepare beyond what was already in place. Rodriguez was creating busy work designed to make Cassandra appear incompetent when she inevitably failed to produce substantive results from a nonsensical assignment. But Cassandra understood something Rodriguez had missed in his focus on manufacturing her failure. Private Torres was genuinely in danger, and the facility's emergency response was inadequate for the specific situation he faced. The locked maintenance area, where Torres was trapped contained chemical storage and electrical systems that pose real hazards to someone unfamiliar with the space. The 30-minute lockdown was designed for security purposes, not personnel safety, and did not account for the possibility of someone being trapped inside with exercise equipment. While Rodriguez continued issuing pointless directives and other personnel followed established protocols that were not designed for this specific emergency, Cassandra quietly assessed the real problem. The maintenance area had external access through a service entrance that was not part of the electronic lockdown system. The route to that entrance required crossing an active training area where live exercises were still ongoing, but it was technically possible for someone with the right skills to reach Torres safely. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Cassandra said, interrupting his increasingly frantic coordination efforts, "I need permission to attempt direct extraction through the service entrance." Rodriguez turned to her with barely concealed satisfaction. "Absolutely not. Emergency protocols specifically prohibit unauthorized personnel from entering affected areas during lockdown situations. The service entrance is not part of the lockdown system," Cassandra replied calmly. "And Private Torres is in immediate danger from chemical exposure in that storage area." "The protocols are clear," Rodriguez insisted, his voice rising. "No exceptions, no unauthorized rescue attempts. We follow established procedures regardless of individual circumstances." It was exactly what Cassandra had expected him to say. Rodriguez was so focused on using the crisis to attack her that he was willing to prioritize bureaucratic compliance over a young soldier's safety. Around them, other personnel were beginning to recognize the inadequacy of the official response. Private Torres had been trapped for over 10 minutes, and the radio communications they had managed to establish revealed that he was becoming increasingly disoriented and potentially making dangerous decisions about the equipment and materials around him. "Sir," Peterson interjected, "if there's a viable extraction route that doesn't violate the lockdown protocols." "The discussion is closed," Rodriguez snapped. "We follow established procedures. Ms. Whitaker, I want those medical response reports immediately, or you will be written up for failure to follow direct orders during an emergency situation." Cassandra looked around at the faces of her colleagues, seeing in their expressions the same recognition she felt. Rodriguez was willing to risk a young soldier's safety to protect his authority and continue his personal vendetta. In that moment, she made a decision that would define everything that followed. "I understand your position, Sergeant Rodriguez," Cassandra said quietly, "but I'm going to extract Private Torres through the service entrance. If you want to write me up afterward, that's your choice." Rodriguez's face turned red with fury. "If you leave this area, you will be immediately terminated and potentially face criminal charges for violating emergency protocols." Cassandra was already moving toward the equipment locker where emergency gear was stored. "Then I guess we'll find out how that works out," she replied, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had finally decided that some things were more important than job security. As she gathered the equipment she would need for the extraction, Cassandra felt a familiar clarity settling over her, the same focused determination that had carried her through the most challenging moments of her military service. Behind her, Rodriguez was shouting orders and threats, but his voice seemed to be coming from a great distance. Around the perimeter of the crisis area, other personnel watched with mixture of admiration and concern as Cassandra prepared to risk everything to save a fellow soldier. The extraction took Cassandra 12 minutes from start to finish. Moving through the active training area required every bit of tactical knowledge her father had taught her, but the skills came back as naturally as breathing. She navigated around ongoing exercises, avoided detection by training observers, and reached the service entrance without triggering any additional alarms or safety protocols. Inside the maintenance area, She found Private Torres in a state of near panic, surrounded by chemical storage containers he did not understand and electrical panels he was afraid to approach. The exercise ammunition he carried posed a real danger in the confined space filled with potentially volatile materials. "Private Torres," Cassandra said as she entered the space, her voice calm and authoritative. "I'm here to get you out. I need you to follow my instructions exactly." The young soldier's relief was immediate and visible. "Yes, ma'am. I don't know how I got here, and I don't know what any of this stuff is." Cassandra quickly assessed the space and Torres's condition. He was physically unharmed but clearly shaken, and his unfamiliarity with the environment was indeed creating unnecessary risks. "First, I need you to set down all your exercise equipment right here," she instructed, indicating a clear area away from chemical storage. "Then we're going to exit through the route I came in. Stay close behind me and do exactly what I do." The return journey was more challenging because she was now responsible for Torres's safety as well as her own. But Cassandra's training had prepared her for exactly this type of tactical movement. They reached the perimeter of the crisis area without incident, arriving just as the automated lockdown was scheduled to release. The response from assembled personnel was immediate and telling. Torres was safe, unharmed, and visibly grateful. The emergency that had consumed everyone's attention for nearly half an hour was resolved with no injuries and minimal disruption to ongoing operations. Rodriguez stood frozen, clearly struggling to process what had just occurred. His carefully constructed crisis had been resolved by the exact person he had been trying to discredit, using methods that exposed the inadequacy of his rigid adherence to protocols that were not designed for the actual situation they faced. Colonel Harrison, who had been contacted during the emergency and arrived just as Cassandra and Torres reached safety, observed the scene with the practiced eye of an experienced officer. "Private Torres," Harrison said, approaching the young soldier, "are you injured or in need of medical attention?" "No, sir," Torres replied. "Ma'am got me out safe. I was pretty scared in there, but she knew exactly what to do." Harrison turned to Rodriguez. "Staff Sergeant, I'd like a detailed report on the emergency response procedures that were followed during this incident." Rodriguez's explanation was stilted and defensive, clearly aware that his handling of the situation would not reflect well. Under scrutiny, he had prioritized protocol compliance over personnel safety and had actively attempted to prevent the action that ultimately resolved the crisis. When Rodriguez finished his report, Harrison turned to Cassandra. "Ms. Whitaker, please describe your actions and decision-making process." Cassandra's account was concise and professional. She explained her assessment of Torres's danger, her evaluation of available extraction routes, and her decision to proceed despite Rodriguez's objections. She made no attempt to criticize Rodriguez directly, but simply described the facts of the situation as she had understood them. "I determined that Private Torres was in immediate danger and that the standard protocols were not adequate for the specific circumstances we faced," she concluded. "I made the decision to proceed with extraction because I believed it was the safest and most effective option available." Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "And your evaluation of the risks involved in your chosen approach?" "Manageable, sir, given my training and experience with tactical movement in complex environments." Harrison spent the next hour conducting individual interviews with other personnel who had witnessed the incident. The picture that emerged was clear and consistent. Rodriguez had prioritized his authority over a soldier's safety, while Cassandra had demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and capability that military leadership values most. That evening, Harrison convened a formal meeting with facility leadership that included Rodriguez, Cassandra, and several senior instructors. After reviewing today's incident, Harrison began, "I have concluded that significant changes are needed in facility leadership and operational procedures." He looked directly at Rodriguez. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, your handling of today's emergency demonstrated poor judgment, inflexible thinking, and a concerning willingness to prioritize administrative compliance over personnel safety. Additionally, the pattern of harassment and discriminatory treatment that led up to today's incident represents a serious failure of professional leadership." Rodriguez sat rigidly, his face pale but his expression still defiant. Effective immediately, Harrison continued, "You are being transferred to administrative duties, pending a formal review of your fitness for instructor positions. You will have no direct authority over training personnel or emergency response situations." Harrison then turned to Cassandra. "Ms. Wigger, your actions today exemplified exactly the kind of judgment, skill, and courage that this facility should be developing in all its personnel. Your combination of technical expertise and tactical knowledge represents a significant asset that has been underutilized." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "I would like to offer you a position as senior training consultant, with responsibility for developing advanced tactical curricula and serving as a primary instructor for specialized skills training." The room fell silent as the implications of the offer became clear. Cassandra would not just be vindicated, she would be elevated to a position of real authority and influence within the facility. The position comes with a significant salary increase, Harrison continued, and the opportunity to help shape how future military personnel are trained. It would also provide you with the platform to honor your father's legacy by passing on the knowledge and skills he taught you. Cassandra looked around the room, seeing in the faces of her colleagues a mixture of respect, admiration, and anticipation. These people had watched her endure months of harassment with quiet dignity, then risk everything to save a fellow soldier when it really mattered. "I accept," she said simply. 3 months later, the Fort Harrison Training Center had become known throughout the military community for the exceptional quality of its advanced tactical training programs. Cassandra's courses in precision marksmanship, tactical movement, and emergency response were consistently oversubscribed, with personnel requesting transfers specifically to attend her programs. Rodriguez had been quietly transferred to a desk position at a different facility, his career effectively ended by his inability to recognize and respect the capabilities of the people under his command. Private Torres, who had recovered completely from his ordeal, specifically requested assignment to one of Cassandra's training courses. "She saved my life," he told anyone who asked, "and then she taught me skills that might save someone else's life someday." On quiet evenings, Cassandra would sit in her new office overlooking the training grounds, watching new groups of students practice the skills her father had taught her so many years ago. She kept his photograph on her desk now, along with the commendations and certificates she had once kept hidden. Peterson, who had been promoted to senior instructor in recognition of his integrity during the Rodriguez situation, often stopped by her office for conversations that had become a valued part of both their routines. "Any regrets?" he asked one evening as they watched a group of students practicing long-range shooting techniques. Cassandra was quiet for a moment, watching a young female recruit successfully engage a target at 600 meters, a shot that would have been impossible for her just weeks earlier. "I spent 3 years trying to hide from who I was," she said finally. "I thought if I could just disappear into a simple life, I could find peace with my past." She turned from the window to face Peterson. "But I've learned that peace doesn't come from hiding your capabilities. It comes from using them in service of something bigger than yourself." Outside, the sound of precise, confident gunfire echoed. Across the training range, the sound of new skills being learned and old ones being passed on to a new generation. "My father always said that the greatest victory is the fight you never have to have because your opponent understands what they're truly facing," Cassandra reflected. "But sometimes, when the moment comes, you have to be willing to show them exactly what that means." In the end, Rodriguez had gotten exactly what he asked for, a demonstration of who was truly professional and who was merely pretending. He just had not expected the answer to be so definitively against him. Cassandra had kept her promise to her father's memory, found her own path to peace, and discovered that sometimes the best way to honor the past is to use it to build something better for the future. The quiet woman who had once moved through the facility, like a ghost, had become exactly what she was always meant to be: a teacher, a protector, and a living bridge between the wisdom of one generation and the potential of the next. Sometimes, the most powerful people are the ones who never need to prove their power until someone truly needs them to. Cassandra Whitaker learned that strength isn't about dominance. It's about knowing when to be silent and when to step forward. Her father's legacy lived on not in the shots she could make, but in the lives she chose to protect and the knowledge she passed on to others. In a world full of people demanding recognition for their authority, she had quietly demonstrated something far more valuable: the wisdom to use her abilities only when they truly mattered, and the courage to risk everything when someone else's safety was on the line. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.